Welcome back to part 2 of chapter 3, ethical issues in the conduct of psychological research. Last time we had kind of taken a journey through the overview of the need for ethics review when we're conducting research and positioning that conversation in the context of doing good science and being good scientists. We're going to continue that and look at some of the other issues related to ethics in research. One topic that remains, something that we, as social scientists, we have to really think hard about is the issue of deception. I mentioned in the last lecture some of those notorious examples of pieces of research, like Stanley Milgram's research on obedience to authority, or Zimbardo's research on following norms and norm formation in interesting social situations. As a social psychologist, I'm well acquainted with using typically mild forms of deception in my research in order to protect the integrity of my hypothesis testing. So deception basically means that if we have a particular hypothesis or set of hypotheses that we want to test, but we can't disclose the nature of our hypotheses, or we have to tell some kind of cover story to our participants so that they believe we're studying something else in order to actually fully test the hypotheses that we have, what we're doing is intentionally deceiving our participants. That's an ethical issue. We're not supposed to lie to people, just as a general rule. That's immoral. So as researchers, how do we navigate this space where if we told researchers exactly what we were studying, would we actually get valid results? And then we have to weigh the costs and benefits of using deception as a tool. I frequently, for example, when I was showing people episodes of television, I didn't tell them specifically that I was interested in whether or not TV shows would influence how dangerous they thought people with mental illness were likely to be. Obviously, if I told them that, it may shape how they respond. So it would essentially then invalidate any findings that I had. So I justified the need to hide my actual hypotheses from participants. I disclosed all of the procedural elements of what they would be asked to do, which is watch a TV episode. I didn't tell them which one they were going to actually see, but I gave them the range. But I couldn't tell them what I was hypothesizing until after their participation was complete. In other studies, the deception is more complete. Like, I was just not disclosing what my hypotheses were. In some cases, though, you have to create a complete cover story. Tell them that you're studying one thing when you're actually studying another. Milgram did that. He told participants that he was studying the effect of punishment on learning, when in fact he was studying something entirely different, which was obedience to authority. Both are examples of deception. One is more mild than the others, but you're still lying, essentially. So what we have to do is justify the deception and then mitigate its impacts. So we start with, acknowledging the fact that when we deceive our participants, we are violating an ethical principle that's built into informed consent. We want to be able to disclose fully what we're asking people to do, and we want to explain why. However, there are certain situations where fully disclosing what we're doing and why would harm our ability to actually complete the project as intended. So if that's necessary, and it's often considered to be necessary in psychological research, we need to, justify it, and we can't expose, by deceiving them, we can't expose people to unnecessary risks while we're doing it. So deceiving people is in order to get them to participate, like lying to them and telling them one story to get them to participate in the first place, that's never justifiable. That's always seen as unethical. However, using deception as a way of protecting your ability to ask and answer your question can be defensible under certain circumstances. So what you have to do as a researcher is carefully weigh, again, the costs and benefits of using whatever deception you choose to use. My general rule as a researcher is use as little deception as possible while still protecting the integrity of the work that you're doing as a researcher. There are advantages and disadvantages. Like any technique that you're going to use as a researcher, there are pros and there are cons. On the one hand, on the advantages side, when you use deception as a strategy, you can get more naturalistic forms of people's behaviors. So for Milgram, for example, by telling people, this is a study of punishment and learning, it gives a cover that allows people's natural behavior to evolve under those circumstances. Perhaps a less notorious example, if I'm telling people to watch television programs, but I'm hiding from them the fact that what I'm interested in is how this affects their attitudes, I'm allowing them to naturally respond to the television programs without any preconceived ideas about what I'm looking for as a researcher. So what that gives me is the ability to investigate their behavior without sort of pre-exposure effects by being told exactly what's expected of them. On the downside, it goes against one of our basic ethical principles of informed consent. It can harm the relationship between the researcher and the participant when there's that strong expectation that people be honest and not deceptive. And if research participants generally assume that they're going to be deceived by researchers, it can interfere with the natural quality of their behavior. It can also interfere with their willingness to continue being participants in the future. So you really have to think through the pros and cons there. When is deception perceived by IRBs and researchers to be justifiable? In some cases, you have to really think about the importance of the work in the context of the need to be deceptive. For instance, in medical research, if you're doing drug trials and you have a control group that has a placebo, for example, if you're talking about really determining the safety and efficacy of, say, a vaccine or a new treatment for, say, heart failure, having a controlled trial where you have a placebo control group, it's essential that if you're a participant, you not know which group you've been assigned to. You may be getting the drug, you may be getting a placebo, and it's essential that you not know so that your expectation of which you're getting doesn't influence how you're reporting your symptoms or how you're feeling. Now, obviously, there's high stakes there. It's important that researchers know whether the medication actually works or whether the vaccine is actually protective, or if it has adverse effects. So you have to think of it in that context. Is the study important enough and is the role of deception in the study critical enough to justify? If there are other methods available that can achieve the same research outcomes, then deception isn't warranted. You also have to think about, in your informed consent procedure, if you have to use deception, for instance, even with the very mild deception that's typically involved in my research projects, I am required to state in the informed consent that they will not be told the true nature of all of the hypotheses until their research participation is complete. And the reason I give in the informed consent form is so that their behavior will not be influenced by the knowledge of what I'm hypothesizing. So basically, I'm telling them I'm going to not disclose all the information. I am going to deceive you in a mild way, but you'll be told everything after the fact. basically in debriefing. So when deception is used, what we're required to do is what I just described. You have to inform people afterwards the full reason for deception. So in my media studies, for example, in my debriefing process, I tell them that what I was really interested in was their beliefs about the dangerousness of people with mental illnesses and their willingness to be helpful. And I was wanting to see if there was an impact of different kinds of media exposure, and explain to them that they were randomly assigned to 3 different groups. So by doing that, what I'm doing is mitigating the deception that I used, which was basically not disclosing my hypotheses in advance. And then in my debriefing process, I make a promise to them to, if they have questions, if they have concerns, if they are upset by the fact that I have not made that disclosure prior to their participation, if they have any negative outcomes, that they can speak to me, or I provide them with other resources that they can reach out to if they have questions, concerns, or negative outcomes. The goal of this is to make sure that participants come out of this not just with no adverse reactions, but also that they feel good about their participation in the research. So with the debriefing process, what we're seeking to do is meet our ethical obligations to benefit participants after their research is over. So and for many of you, you've been participants in research projects, and you may have seen, if you were in an internet study, like a SurveyMonkey, a screen pops up after you're done. It gives you a 1 or 2 paragraph debriefing statement. That's one example. If you were in a medical study, the debriefing process would probably be much more extensive, such that you can have check-ins over time to make sure that you're still doing well, and that your needs are being met and your questions are being answered. So it really depends on the nature of the experiment itself, just how extensive that process would be. The debriefing process should be beneficial for both participants and the researchers. So for example, if I was conducting a piece of research and after the debriefing, I find out that there were some interesting reactions that people had to the process of being in my study, that may in fact prompt changes to my methodology in the future. It could prompt new questions for me to ask in my research projects in the future as well. It benefits participants too in the broad sense. They learn more about the research process and their role in it, and they learn more about what you were intending to study in your work. Part of our obligation is to explain why we needed to use deception as soon as it is possible to do so. I've had some research projects, mostly SEE studies that students have done, where it was really important for them not to debrief until all of the data was completely collected. So what they did was to inform participants after their initial participation that after our full data collection is completed during, say, the last week of February of 20 whatever, you will receive an email, and in that email will be a full debriefing statement, was something that those researchers had to do, because it was a long-term study, and it was a study that participants had to return for 3 appointments in their work. And if say the first wave of participants kind of knew the whole thing and they'd gotten their full debriefing, they might tell other potential participants and it would influence their behavior. So we didn't want that to happen. So we did a delayed debriefing and those reasons were disclosed to participants during the process. Debriefing forms or debriefing conversations, if they're done in person, they need to fully disclose the nature of the research and any parts of that were withheld for methodological reasons. And then as was stated on the previous slide, the overarching goal is you want people to feel good about their role in the research process. What it allows you to learn as a researcher is how participants were thinking about your procedure. Maybe your deception was ineffective. Maybe they knew all along what you were intending to study. And if they communicate that to you as a part of their debriefing process, that's a problem. And you would need to modify your methodology and do a better job of it. Now, in research with animals, some other considerations that we need to think about in our trade-off, in our cost-benefit analysis, we have to really think about how the knowledge that we gain in animal research will benefit people, will benefit society, will benefit for perhaps even other animals. So depending on the context, and research with animal subjects is always controversial because you're dealing with organisms that are sentient who can't meaningfully consent to being involved in research. There are loads of horrific images on the internet, I'm sure you can find them readily, of animals that are being obviously harmed in research. Be aware that there's a lot of urban nonsense, urban legend nonsense out there. Some of it propagated by animal rights organizations, but there are also egregious examples of harm done to animals for what appear to be unnecessary reasons. And that's why we have IACUCs. We have these oversight boards that are designed to help prevent unnecessary use and abuse of animals in research. So, like with human research, we have to do that, the benefits versus the risks, and we have to engage in a lot of thinking about what the species is like, how it needs to be housed, how it needs to be cared for in order to be healthy, what kind of procedures we're going to engage in with the animal, what kind of suffering the animal is going to experience, and so on. If animals have to, quote unquote, be sacrificed or die in order to have their tissue examined, how is that going to be done? And is it going to be done in a painless way for those organisms? Those are just examples of questions that you have to explore. So researchers using animals, non-humans, are obligated to acquire animals in an ethical way, care for animals in an ethical way, engage in procedures with animals ethically, and dispose of animals, i.e. End their lives and then dispose of their bodies in compliance with the law. And IACUCs are the oversight group at universities that basically they follow federal, state, and local laws and help to ensure that researchers at a given organization are going to comply with those standards. So that may mean that there are laboratories where animals are housed and used in research have to be inspected on a regular basis. Reports have to be filed when medications are used, how food is used, how food is stored, how often cages are cleaned, for example. One of my worst jobs as an undergraduate student was in my undergraduate advisor did research on the visual system, on the visual perceptual system for, I believe it was for the Air Force. I can be wrong about that. It might have been Navy. I think it was Air Force. But they were wanting to study the effect on visual acuity and perception on the eye of passive laser exposure. Apparently at the time they were using this equipment and they wanted to know if there were problems in terms of the exposure to laser light for pilots in terms of their visual perceptual systems. This particular researcher used rhesus macaques. I'm not a fan, but if I were them, I wouldn't have been a fan of me either. These were macaques that, based on federal standards at the time, were housed appropriately. They had fairly small cages. They were fed on a regular schedule. And they were given enrichment experiences. One of their enrichment experiences, they loved Sesame Street, so they watched Sesame Street a lot. I had to clean their cages. These were all male macaques. They were veteran research subjects. They were not always pleasant, and they could be really surly. But I had to go through an orientation. I had to learn a lot about the IACUC regulations, about the care of these animals. I also learned a lot about how they were engaged in the procedure of doing their learning tasks and being exposed or not exposed to laser light while I was there. The use of animals is often very complex. You know, the documentation that my professor had to keep and maintain on the use of the macaques was extensive and complicated. It also was controversial. There was more than one occasion where animal rights activists were critical of his work and the animals that he cared for. There was often conversation about the threat to the lab, and the complications were such that he changed species to a species that was less controversial. Actually, he switched to turtles, who knew a visual system more that was comparable to what needed to be done, but the species was not as controversial as macaques. So, just as an example, the issues are complex, and the species that you choose, the level and degree of care that's required needs a great deal of attention and time. I copied I screenshotted this image from your text because I want you to remember to read it and give it special attention. Because the moral issues when we're talking about using animals and often, intentionally inflicting harm on them, such as infecting them with diseases or manipulating their genetics in order to test certain hypotheses. Their mere existence is a manipulation for research, for example, or testing products for safety. It may in fact be that the products are not safe and that the animals are harmed. One researcher that used to be a part of our program, he was a brain injury researcher, and the rats that he used in his research they were exposed to intentionally inflicted brain injuries. So it runs the gamut. It may be a learning study and the rats get to solve mazes and they are never physically injured or drug exposed or disease exposed or anything like that. But in other cases, you're actually talking about either overt genetic manipulation or inflicting, for example, a brain injury. So the ethical and moral issues for us as researchers when we propose using non-human animals in our work are ethically challenging and morally challenging. And ultimately, you as an individual need to think through where you stand morally on these issues. You may come out on the side of saying it's never okay to use an organism that can't consent in a research project. You may come out of it saying when the benefits are very high and the stakes are high, it's justifiable to use non-human species under very careful circumstances. But it's really, you need to make that kind of moral judgment and think about the issues carefully as you do. Now we're going to kind of shift gears to a different set of ethical issues in research, to talking about reporting. We have responsibilities as members of the scientific community to report our research results in an ethical manner, in an appropriate and honest manner. When we, as investigators, when we have research that we've invested a great deal of time in, and we have findings that we believe need to be shared with the world of other scholars, then our goal is to communicate our findings in this peer-reviewed kind of environment. And by peer-reviewed, what we mean is I give my results, I submit them to a journal. The journal editor then sends my document to other professionals who have similar range of experience, who have some level of expertise in the area that my research is in. They read my research, they evaluate it, provide critical feedback, and they can either suggest to the editor, reject it, accept it but with revisions. Sometimes those revisions are major, sometimes they're minor, or they could accept it outright. And then it's published. All of your, the APA code provides some rules about what you put into that peer-reviewed process, and how you have to report things. Obviously you can't lie about the data that you collected and the nature of the data in its original form. You can't be deceptive, because obviously that's bad and it's wrong and it has very negative consequences. You also have to kind of build into this whole process that there are decisions that have to be made about who should get publication credit. Often, many researchers can be involved in a project from start to finish, but their level of contribution is different, not just in the writing of the article, but in the conduct of the research itself. Having been embroiled in situations where there were disagreements about who contributed what, I know that it can be really dicey. I've been involved in a project, for example, where my role was I managed the data collection, I did the data analysis, and I wrote the results section. And then we got tangled up because one of the parties, one of the researchers wanted to write about it in a particular way, and the others of us didn't want to write about it in that way. And that one person went off and tried to publish it without disclosing who we were and what our contributions were. Well, that's just wrong. It's unethical, it's dishonest. So we made a claim and made them fix it. So yeah, I give you that as just an example that even once the data is in, you're out of the lab, you've finished, you've written it up, there's still ethical considerations about how you present the information in the broader world of scientists. So what's required? You recognize the work of others, and that includes student researchers. You also recognize the work of others in your writing. So when you write your paper, you're going to cite other researchers who influenced the work that you did. You have to cite them. You have to honestly do so that you're not plagiarizing their work or taking their words as your own. That's why, your faculty, we harp on you about you have to cite your sources and you have to do it right. And sometimes students just don't understand the significance of that. When you take someone else's intellectual work, I don't care if it's on the internet or not. I've had a lot of students say, it's on the internet, it's public property. I'm like, no, your words are your words. Even if they're a Twitter post, they're your words. And if you cite them in a paper that you're presenting, whether it's for a class that you're in or at an academic conference, you need to cite them because they're not your words. That's considered unethical. So using proper citations, if you're quoting directly, you have to use quotation marks. If you're paraphrasing, you have to still attribute to the author and the time at which the words were spoken or written. Doing otherwise is considered a really, really big no-no in the scientific world. Part of why this is so significant is that we are a community of scholars. We have a kind of a moral and ethical contract with each other that we will respect the contributions of other scientists that we work with, and we will honor and value their contributions independent of us. And basically we won't steal their work and take it as if it's our own. So that's seen as really, really, really important. Just some reminders about plagiarism. I'm sure you've gotten many, many lectures on this. When you took the PSY 120 course, there's a whole module on plagiarism. Just some bullet points. Don't present work that isn't yours as if it was yours. Even if you're copying one or two words in a row that aren't yours, if it's a key idea and you don't attribute that to the source, it's plagiarism. Being sloppy in your note-taking and then thinking, yeah, I'll go back and cite that later, that's not a good excuse. It just isn't. You have to be very careful to cite your sources appropriately, even when you are paraphrasing. And when you're paraphrasing, you can't just, use a thesaurus and swap a word around here or there or slightly change the structure of a sentence. That's not actually paraphrasing, that's just plagiarism. So, and as I said before, I've had students tell me, the internet is just a public forum. I can take whatever I want from there and cut and paste it. No, you can't. That's plagiarism. I don't care who told you that, they were wrong. I have had a couple of students say, well, in my high school they said, and I'm like, who is this they that I would like to personally, find and throttle? I don't know that they told you that. Whoever they is, they were wrong. Cutting and pasting from the internet is just, it's plagiarism any way you try and reframe it. Now again, I've done a screenshot here of one of the tables from your chapter. They give you some concrete examples if you need a refresher for working with text, both in quoted and paraphrased material. Please refresh your memory on these ideas, because as we start the semester project, you will be writing an introduction section, you will be doing some article summaries, and I will expect you not to plagiarize when you're doing so. Now the chapter concludes with asking you to do some critical thinking about these ethical issues. One of the things I really like about the Shaughnessy, Zeichmeister, and Zeichmeister text is they just are really adept at giving you concrete examples, multiple examples of the things that they're talking about. And they do a really good job in the chapter of giving you examples throughout the chapter and asking you to think about these issues in a critical way. So when you're asking yourself questions about the ethics of a particular piece of research, we start with saying, how do we make decisions about whether a given study is or is not ethical? I've often had, kind of debates in my social psych class with students who, when we're studying Zimbardo or we're studying Milgram, who already have this preformed idea in their head that Zimbardo's work and Milgram's work were just de facto unethical and immoral, that they were wrong, that they were bad people. And I have to kind of dial them back from that and think, if this research were being proposed today to an IRB, how would it be received? And in fact, there have been replications of both studies within the last decade with very similar methods. The informed consent and debriefing processes were much tighter and much more carefully monitored. But the basic methodologies were just not that different than what was used in the original studies. And they were subjected to the same IRB restrictions that we have today. So before you kind of in your head say, Milgram was a very bad man and nothing that he did back then would be permitted today, that's not really accurate. So you have to really think about the rules, the ethical standards, and the obligations that researchers have, and remind yourself what's required to decide if a piece of research is ethical or not. Then you have to think about, what if people disagree with you? And guaranteed they will disagree with you. I used to, when I was on the IRB, and I was chair of the IRB committee for many years, I would get into disputes with one of my favorite colleagues who was the outside member, the non-researcher member of the committee. And we got into lots of disagreements where I would say, but that methodology is standard practice in X discipline, because I happened to know that it was. And his response was always, just because it's standard practice doesn't mean it's moral. And we would disagree about those things. I also, I told you about my work-study job cleaning up monkey poop. We had lots of really deep conversations as a lab about the ethics of using these macaques in this research, and how morally troubling it could be at times to see the animals being housed in the particular way that they were housed. So people will have disagreements. That is an important, critical part of the process of ethical review, is having a dialogue and sorting out the issues. You can ask yourself, is there a right answer? And for many of these ethical debates, there is no one right answer. And many times what you're shooting for is, as you're ensuring that the benefits outweigh the risks, are we doing that balance in such a way that the risks are pushed as close to minimal as possible? We're not saying we have to push the benefits as high as possible. We're saying we push the risks as low as possible. But even then, there's not a right answer. There is the best balance instead of a right answer. So the best that we can do is follow the guidelines, follow the standards, and be open to criticism of our techniques and our choices in the research that we do. So what kind of steps do you need to follow in order to be compliant ethically? Well, first, you have to look at the facts. You have to look at take this from the standpoint, imagine you're on an ethics board, you're on an IRB or an IACUC board. You have to look at the proposed research. Who are the participants or the subjects if they are non-humans? What's the procedure? What kind of cost-benefit analysis has been proposed? And once you've reviewed those facts, then you have to really identify for yourself as the reviewer, what are the relevant ethical issues? Or if you're the researcher, you've come up with an idea, you've done the background research, and you're starting to think through your procedure and who your potential participants are. Then the next step is, what are the relevant ethics issues? If you're in a particularly dicey area, what are the laws about privacy, for example? Real straightforward example, in the university system, there's federal law called FERPA. I'm sure you're well aware of it. It protects your privacy as a student. If I wanted to do research that involved me getting access to, say, your academic disciplinary records or your grades, there are clear ethical issues about privacy, about confidentiality, but there are also legal issues that I, as a researcher, would need to be aware of in terms of my personal liability, risk to the participants, but also risk to my institution. You would also be best to look at your own research, or if you're the reviewer, look at the research that you're reviewing from multiple points of view, which is why we require that IRBs have people from different disciplinary perspectives and also parties who are not a part of the institution that sponsors the organization. So you have to look at it from the participants' point of view. You have to look at it from the point of view of other researchers. You have to look at it from an institutional impact point of view. Look at it from a societal standpoint, from a moral standpoint. So for example, with the macaques, I was a college student in the 1980s, so remember, it's been quite some time since that research was conducted. For decades, it had been normative for macaques to be kept in very small cages and confined, to have not free range kind of experiences, no outdoor exposure. and things like that. But over the course of the next several years, the perspective, the point of view on how primates should be cared for in laboratory research really dramatically shifted, such that the viewpoint had to take into consideration many of the complaints, the concerns, the issues associated with the care and use of this particular species. So it really shifted the way we had to, as researchers, think about what we were doing. And it prompted my mentor to shift what he was doing in terms of which species was being used. And that prompts me to say, are there other methods? You know, it wasn't just for my mentor as an undergraduate, it wasn't just the threat to the lab of outside agitators damaging our equipment or stealing the animals. That was a consideration. The primary consideration, though, was, is there a way we can do this that doesn't involve, you know, housing animals in a way that the emerging belief was inhumane for those particular animals. So what he was able to do was to identify a species that had a visual system that was comparable to represent a human model, but was easier to maintain in a healthy and safe and humane environment, and it ended up being turtles. Go figure. That was also less objectionable to animal rights activists as well. So that concludes my coverage of Chapter 3. In retrospect, I should have divvied up the chapter a little differently because the first lecture was much longer than the second. I'll try to do better in the future.